So next point on the agenda, Azerbaijan, the case of İlqar Məmmədov. Now, first of all, Göring de Odenberg, 1 minute.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you, Mr. President. This year was to be a good one for Azerbaijan in the run-up to the presidential elections. It's worrying that the opposition is being intimidated. It's worrying that the head of a Baku school and opposition presidential candidate İlqar Məmmədov has been arrested. The fact is, Azerbaijan must live up to its undertakings under the European Convention on Human Rights, especially ahead of the rotating presidency of the Council of Europe in 2014. This is in line with Azerbaijan's commitments to the Council of Europe and the OSCE. We call for the immediate release of İlqar Məmmədov and all other political prisoners in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan must reform and guarantee a free trial for everybody.
Dank, Frau Kollegin Göring de Odenberg.
Thank you. Gerald Hefner, 1 minute. Thank you very much indeed, President. Dear colleagues, in October of this very year, in Azerbaijan there are elections after decades of being ruled by the Aliyev regime. The chairman of the Republic Alternativ, İlqar Məmmədov, has said he's going to stand against the president. Beginning of the year, there was violence in Asaili, a city in Azerbaijan. Mr. Məmmədov visited it afterwards with politicians, with observers, journalists, people who are involved in these circles, and then was arrested because allegedly he's supposed to have incited these violences, demonstrations. He's now in prison. So that's one case of many in Azerbaijan where people just disappear, they're incarcerated. Not that they've been proven to have done anything wrong, but they have spoken in a politically incorrect way. So obviously it's worthwhile for Azerbaijan to have close cooperation with the European Union, and it's mutual. But I think we have to say quite clearly that the kernel of cooperation in Eastern Partnership as well is the associations agreements, which must include respecting human rights, democracy, personal freedoms, human values, freedom to associate, and those sorts of things. Without respect of those values, we can't have that cooperation.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Heft.
Thank you, Mr. Hefner. 1 minute, Mr. Schake.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, colleagues. Azerbaijan has itself committed to the respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms and the rule of law in the context of the Eastern Partnership, its membership of the Council of Europe and the OSCE. But these agreements are not signatures on paper. They must translate to action. Political trials, repression of civil society and media must end. Specifically, İlqar Məmmədov must be released and charges against him dropped. The intimidation of journalists, fining of demonstrators or banning peaceful assembly altogether are unacceptable. I urge President Barroso to take up human rights and media freedom at the highest level when he meets President Aliyev on June 21st. Our economic, energy and strategic interests must not be overshadowing the very importance of human rights. The people in Azerbaijan look to the EU as a community of values, and they rightfully do so. We must not turn our backs towards those people who deserve their fundamental freedoms to be protected.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Schake.
Thank you, Mrs. Schake. 1 minute, Milan Kabanov.
Vážený pane předsedající.
Mr. President, I'm not an author, so could you possibly take that off the screen? In our motion for resolution, we should call on the Azerbaijani government to deal with the Məmmədov case swiftly and fairly, and he should be released from custody. A presidential candidate should not only be able to stand for election, he should also be able to conduct an election campaign. In the Məmmədov case, we should avoid referring to things like an independent media, NGOs, free elections, the OECD office. We have committees and delegations to do that sort of thing, but members of the European Parliament don't seem to be interested.
Now, Rosa Thun-Hohenstein, 1 minute.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you, Mr. President. Imprisoning opponents, torturing potential presidents is a scandal, especially when it happens in a country that's trying to dress itself up as having democratic apparel. Azerbaijan is in the Council of Europe. It is going to have the rotating presidency in 2014. It is in the Eastern Partnership. EU-Azerbaijan negotiations on an association agreement are ongoing. And yet we have a presidential candidate in prison facing abusive treatment. Many people wanted a tougher motion for resolution in defense of İlqar Məmmədov, and I very much support that.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin.
Thank you. Now for the groups. Monica Macovei, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. I condemn the arrest of İlqar Məmmədov on the 4th of February following peaceful protests. No reasons have been given for the arrest and imprisonment. False accusations have been levelled against İlqar Məmmədov. He's accused of some kind of violent action. The protests were peaceful, and surely any people should have the right to criticize their government. The pinnacle of irony is that İlqar Məmmədov was not even present at the protests. The fact is, İlqar Məmmədov has been imprisoned and his rights are being abused. We've seen the same sort of thing happen in Turkey and in Russia. We have to fight for democracy day after day.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Macovei.
Thank you, Mrs. Macovei. 1 minute to Joanna Senyszyn.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you, Mr. President. Azerbaijan has signed up to the European Convention of Human Rights without dealing with the problem of political prisoners. There is no press freedom. The internet is restricted. There are restrictions on NGOs and freedom of assembly. We appeal to the Azerbaijani authorities to allow journalists and the media to do their work in safety. Uncensored access to the internet is vital for democracy and the rule of law. It is crucial for the association agreement between the EU and Azerbaijan to take account of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and freedom of association. President Barroso should raise these issues when the President of Azerbaijan visits Brussels. Thank you.
Zbigniew Ziobro, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Azerbaijan is an important partner of the European Union, especially when it comes to gas supplies. the Nabucco project, if it comes into being, will do much for security of energy supply in EU member states. We should pull out all the stops to get the best possible relationship with that country and to reduce our dependence on Russia. And that's the nub. Despite some glimmers of hope for human rights in Azerbaijan, the electoral calendar has shown that the rest of the world might be disappointed, especially if it thought that human rights were to be a measure of relations between countries. The October presidential elections loom, and the opposition candidate is in custody. That suggests that President Aliyev is not the world's greatest democrat. That deserves a debate. I think these views should be heard, and I think it should be heard at the right address. These are things that we need to say loud and clear. We must demand respect for human rights, and we don't want Azerbaijan sent into the arms of Russia. Russia is waiting.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Schobo.
Thank you, Mr. Schobo. Now, other speakers. Mr. Kelly, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, Russia and Azerbaijan have much in common, and particularly in relation to their disdain for freedom of the press, freedom of association, and intolerance of opposition. And while much was expected of the upcoming elections in Azerbaijan in October, it has been very disappointing the way it is being approached. And Ilqar Məmmədov is a case in point. The leader of the opposition, wanting to run for president, thrown into prison on trumped-up charges of inciting riots, has his pre-trial detention postponed twice, and is allegedly in a punishment cell. He will probably be released or put on trial when the elections are over. This just is not tolerable, and we have to use all our means and everything at our disposal to have him released as soon as possible, so a fair election can be conducted. And I think that's key at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Corina Cretu, 1 minute.
I agree with those who disagree with the way the Azerbaijani authorities are treating the European Union. What has happened is indeed disappointing, especially as Azerbaijan is going to hold the rotating presidency of the Council of Europe in 2014. İlqar Məmmədov, the presidential candidate, is being pooted. This is a sign of the deterioration of human rights in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan should organize a democratic election, respect the opposition, and not criminalize internet activity. I call on Commissioner Barroso to ensure human rights are respected by other countries. This should be taken up with the Azeri government and its president.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Cretu.
Thank you. Marek Migalski, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. Azerbaijan is an important regional player. It's a key trade partner of the European Union, and let's hope its importance will grow, especially when it comes to energy supplies. That doesn't mean, however, that we're going to give Azerbaijan an easy ride on human rights. We call for respect for human rights in Russia, an alleged partner. We should also call for respect for human rights in a country that's a real partner, Azerbaijan. I think it's wrong to misinterpret Mr. Tsabrnokh. Mr. Tabarnoch runs the delegation dealing with these issues. And if he was criticizing anyone, he was criticizing members of the European Parliament. He heads a delegation which isn't able to do its work properly because MEPs don't turn up for meetings. The ECR is clear on this issue and we have signed up to this motion for resolution. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Migalski. Wir kommen nun zum
Thank you. Catch the eye now. Please, all of you. The speaker has lost his microphone. Please keep to 1 minute. Sophia.
Kiitoksia, arvoisa puhemies.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mammadov is an opposition politician who's been criticizing the government for human rights restrictions for a long time. He's been threatened before. In February, he was arrested at a peaceful demonstration and he is now facing trumped-up charges. Human Rights Watch has called on the Azerbaijani government to present charges against Mammadov and his colleague. This is particularly important ahead of Azerbaijan's chairmanship of the Council of Europe. You can't have a country that does this to its political opposition running the key human rights institution in Europe. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Essayah.
Thank you. Mrs. Uyuland.
Thank you, Chairman. As a strategic partner for the European Union, Azerbaijan knows and adheres to a strong economic model, a climate of religious tolerance and secularity. One could imagine that our Azerbaijani partners expect a more pragmatic and more balanced attitude from the European Union. This resolution clearly supports the ongoing negotiations on EU and Azerbaijani association agreement. At the same time, of course, this resolution reminds Azerbaijani friends that they are members of the Council of Europe with all commitments of their democracy, rule of law and human rights. I'd like to call upon continuing the good and open dialogue we have with the Republic of Azerbaijan and to contribute to the rapprochement of both the European and Azerbaijani people. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau.
Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Kurski.
Thank you, Mr. Kurski. Ms. Kohler, 1 minute.
Thank you. Azerbaijan has committed itself to respecting human rights. Moreover, it intends to take the rotating presidency of the Council of Europe in 2014. Opposition leader Mammadov's arrest ahead of the October presidential elections looks like a political act. We call on the Azerbaijani authorities to release Mammadov and to give him a fair trial. Just as in past resolutions on Azerbaijan, we have to refer to media freedom. There should be no harassment, no arrests of opposition figures, and Europe's external affairs, external action service should do the necessary to have human rights respected.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin.
Thank you, Ms. Kohler. 7 to close.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioner. Today I've taken the floor on Azerbaijan, another country that wants to join the EU, which is persecuting people with dissenting political views. This time we're talking about İlqar Məmmədov, a politician who is the presidential candidate of the opposition. He's been imprisoned like a common criminal, like a murderer. Yet this is an opposition politician. The arrest of Mammadov, who was behind many democratic initiatives, has led to a wave of concern in Azerbaijan in the European Union and in the world. At the beginning of May, the Council of Europe called on the Azerbaijani authorities to release all political prisoners, and yet the call has fallen on deaf ears. That is appalling, especially as that country is going to be taking the rotating presidency of the Council of Europe for 6 months.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Hieb.
Thank you, Mrs. Hibner. That's it for Catch the Eye. Now to tie up, Commissioner Lewandowski.
Honourable members, addressing you again on behalf of High Representative Catherine Ashton, I wish to thank members of this House for their interest in this matter, their points carefully noted. The case of Mr. Mammadov is a serious case, merits the attention of the European Union, firstly because of the way it has been handled, and secondly because of its wider significance in terms of freedom of a political opposition to conduct business in a presidential election year. We are worried about the period of so-called isolation detention enforced on Mr. Mammadov, during which he has been neither able to receive visits from his family nor food from outside the prison. And more generally, and this is obvious, his continuing detention reduces the chances of İlqar Məmmədov to run as nominated by his real party as a candidate in the presidential elections. I wish to assure you that both High Representative Catherine Ashton and Commissioner Stefan Füle both are following closely political developments, and in their meetings with the leaders of Azerbaijan and also in public statements, 2 strong public statements on independent and transparent investigation and full respect of his human and civil rights, are simply not silent on the matter. This is in line with the concept of deep democracy in our space, in our European space, that is taking not only the technicalities of the election process into account, but also the essential freedoms of politicians and citizens to interact, and for policy choices to be promoted and debated, including in the electronic media and the internet. So, that is, as it was with the discussed previously Russian Federation cases, the wider issue of judicial system and how it is performing, and not just the case of Mr. Mammadov. And of course this is also a part of our dialogue with Azerbaijan, as mentioned also in this House. This is a partner with high stakes for the European Union, but the mature relationship should allow to frank speaking when it is needed, and this is the case we need for frank speaking. The resolution before the House will certainly be taken, and here are important issues like judicial performance, defamation legislation, freedom of assembly and electoral legislation. But I have to assure you that this is what happens in Azerbaijan is also closely monitored and activated. The EU delegation there, the head of delegation was able to meet with Mr. Mammadov on 4th April. The delegation is also in close contact with the family and lawyers of Mr. Mammadov. And this is not only for Mr. Mammadov, but also for the other detainees, including Mr. Tofik Yakublu, who is also in pre-trial detention. I am pleased to tell you that the EU delegation in Baku visited Mr. Yakublu in jail earlier this week, and as it is in his case, Mammadov's case, generally we continue to monitor and intervene in all of the relevant cases and have a close view of the developments in Azerbaijan. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. That concludes the debate.